Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Welcome to All Things Policy. Today in the studio, Rijesh, Bharath and I are planning to chat about a paper titled The Superintelligence Strategy, written by Dan Hendricks, Eric Schmidt and others. This paper is basically a view into how AI is progressing, what it will do to our society, to the global world order, to international relations, and how we can prepare in anticipating these effects. Rijesh and Bharath both work in the high-tech geopolitics program at the Takshashila Institution, and they have written and thought about AI and national power and AI governance for a long time now. Welcome, Rijesh and Bharath.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So diving straight into the paper, this was a very interesting paper because, we are actually reading about very outlandish, I would say outlandish, but also not very given the current context. But at least a decade ago, we were reading about, and these kinds of literature in science fiction books. But now we are actually reading this in serious academic literature. And the paper just draws out, it anticipates how superintelligence may evolve given today's AI landscape, and how AI can possibly outperform humans on all the relevant metrics, and how we have to hedge against that and prepare for that. But before we go into what the paper says we must do, what do you think? How close are we to an actual superintelligence emerging? Is this very alarmist? Is it actually realistic? What are your thoughts?
So, no, I don't think it's overly alarmistic. I mean, depending on where you stand on or how deep you are in the AI space, you will see different kinds of forecasts for superintelligence. Firstly, I will point out that the paper is not exclusively talking about like a Skynet kind of superintelligence that will take over the world. They're just talking about above human performance in AI models. I think there's a forecasting site called Metaculus, which actually has a question around this with specifics around what they define as a general AI system. So the median forecast there is that by the mid-2030s, which is like less than 10 years away, you should have a general AI intelligence system which is smarter than humans. So it's not outlandish. I think it is good to have reports like this, that take that side of this equation and say that if there is a probability of this kind of a system happening, what should countries do in terms of their national strategy? I mean, the way I come at it is that I can't assign a zero probability to this happening, right? I'm not 100% sure that the current LLM-based model of building models will not lead to AGI. I don't know enough, so I can't assign zero probability to it. As far as I know, nobody assigns a zero probability to it. So you have to have some strategy on the off chance that it does happen. So therefore, I think it's not alarmist. It's worth studying it and coming up with your ideas on it.
To add to what Rijesh is saying, right? So if you go back just a few years back, so a lot of academics or people working in AI would have said that AGI or superintelligence is something that's very far away. Now, this paper actually defines what they call superintelligence as something where the AI is better than humans in a wide range of tasks. So they're not calling it AGI because that's a sort of a vague term. So as long as it's better than humans in a wide range of cognitive tasks, they're calling that superintelligence. And by that definition, I think what you've seen over the past few years is that a lot of people building AI are saying that it's going to happen next year or in a couple of years, but a lot of other academics and researchers as well are saying that it's not something that's science fiction anymore. It's something that could happen maybe 10 years in the future or a couple of decades away. And they say, based on this, you can maybe think that if you don't believe that, the burden of proof has shifted to those who have a different opinion, and it's not the conventional wisdom or the belief among people who are building this is not that it's not going to happen, or that's not a possibility, but that is something that's likely to happen. And this kind of a strategy that the paper is talking about is something that you need to prepare for. And like Rijesh was saying, if it's a non-zero possibility, then you need to have a strategy for something like that happening. And that's where they might be coming from.
So coming to the ideas of the paper, it proposes 3 broad ideas about what our action needs to be. One, it is talking about deterrence in terms of what they call a mutual assured AI malfunction strategy. In this setup, the paper basically talks about how nations can ensure that no single nation treads across the safety line of what is considered a responsible development and use of AI technologies. So that there is, and as you can already see, there is a parallel to nuclear weapons in the way nuclear deterrence works. But some of the other ideas it also talks about is controlling how AI technology spreads through the control of chips and model weights. And lastly, to stay competitive, that's a more more of a positive step rather than a restrictive one, where it says we have to still stay competitive and we have to still integrate AI into a lot of the technologies and processes that we already have. But coming to the deterrence framework, we see that AI is being constantly compared and parallels being drawn with nuclear weapons. What do you think of this analogy? I mean, fundamentally, there is always a problem with having analogies between 2 different technologies, because technologies have to be judged on their own merit. You can't say AI is like this, it's like that. AI is like AI. It's new, it's emergent, and we don't even know what it's going to be. But still having analogies, I think, is a very useful way of having the human mind think about scenarios and solutions. So is this analogy a fitting one, or does it actually lock us into a frame of mind where we get sidelined with some of the possibilities and potential?
So let's look at it 2 ways, right? One criticism of this analogy of MAME as MAD was by Pranay in one of his, I think, 293 of
And
the
MAD would be mutually assured destruction.
Mutually assured destruction. Yeah. So in that particular newsletter 293, that one from Pranay, he basically argues that MAME is trying to stop the development of the technology itself, whereas MAD was never about trying to stop the development of nuclear weapons. It was about stopping the use of it, right? So that's one argument against it. The second argument against this idea is that it's twofold. One is how easy is it to go out and sabotage someone, to actually create a credible mutual deterrence? And 2, when do you go and sabotage someone, right? If somebody is like DeepSeek is a great example, right? People within the AI community knew DeepSeek was doing a lot of interesting stuff, but one could argue that the broader world was very surprised when DeepSeek came out. So if someone is developing strong AI, super intelligent AI in secret, it's going to be very difficult for a competing nation to figure out where they are along this thing. And the problem with this thing, I actually think that rather than creating responsible deterrence, it's very unstable, this particular deterrence regime, the MAME regime, because you can't really tell how far along somebody is, and you have to be proactive, because once they develop it, you're never going to catch up to them, right? So those are the 2 main arguments that have been made against it. But the other way I thought of it, one way in which I think that the analogy is correct, is that if a super intelligent AI is developed, that is the equivalent of a nuclear attack happening. It's happened once the AI is developed. And therefore, the attempt to develop the AI is the same as the attempt to fire a nuclear weapon. So in that sense, MAME and MAD are equivalent, right? It is correct to try and stop the AI from developing, because once it has developed, you really don't know what the outcomes are. There might be loss of control to the AI, there might be proliferation, or one country will have such a huge advantage over everybody else that there is just no other recourse. So that's another way to think about it, which I think is what that report is trying to say, that the attempt to develop a super intelligent AI is exactly like trying to fire a nuclear weapon. That's why you must try to deter it at that stage. So, I mean, those are the two sides of that argument. Not sure which side I land on, but that's what it is.
I think my thought was usually when you've seen an analogy being offered, the AI was being compared to either the internet and how it had spillover effects for a lot of other kind of industries, or electricity, right? So it had a lot of positive externalities, and they're saying AI could be that kind of a diffusion heavy technology which could enable things. But here they're taking a more dual use kind of technology to illustrate that this is not just going to have positive spillover effects, but it could also have things that you need to be concerned about. So that's where I think the nuclear analogy makes sense to some extent, that it highlights some of the concerns that they might be. So it works in that sense. Now, when it comes to using this analogy, they're talking about having an escalation ladder. So you want deterrence to work in a way that if an adversary does something, you will do something else in return, and that you won't take your most extreme step to start off with, but it's an escalation ladder of sorts, right? So, and I think they have highlighted starting with espionage and trying to steal secrets or weights of the opponents or adversaries' models or something like that, all the way to large-scale attacks on data centers and trying to disable the infrastructure that is used to train AI. So, so as an idea, how MAME would work, it's a little difficult for me to imagine, because unlike, say, nuclear or other technologies, AI is not something that has trickled down from government having taken the lead in developing it, and then the civilian use cases have come about. It's actually the reverse. So civilian or common use cases are where the cutting edge AI applications are being developed, and then they are being applied to military or critical tech kind of use cases. So because of this shift, right? So it's not a very centralized thing where you can say that you can control how it diffuses. You don't have that kind of a centralized choke point where you can control it. So I don't know how effectively it will work because of this kind of a way in which the technology is being developed. And another technology that you can think of that has had this kind of a trajectory is semiconductors, which Pranay keeps talking about when he compares it with other technologies. So your mobile phone might have a more advanced chip than, say, a really advanced military application, a device. So similar to that, I think AI is in a place where civilian applications are far ahead, and there is maybe an economy or use cases to generate investment and then revenue, and then feed that back and do all of these things, right? So because of those things, I don't know how effective the containment strategy will be.
Yeah. I mean, I also think another interesting issue with this MAME escalation strategy is that, the initial phase is fine. You might argue that we'll do espionage and we'll sabotage the data and poison the data, and all of that might be possible. But at the end of the day, you can't sabotage beyond a point, right? Data will be backed up. You can always restart from a previous checkpoint. And you're never going to sabotage ideas, right, unless you do something to their human capital. And above that stage, above a certain escalation point, you're talking about things like taking out data centers and power centers. At that point, you're basically at war. So, in fact, if you actually escalate to that point, and let's say if US and China are escalating beyond that point where you're attacking each other's infrastructure, then even the nuclear deterrence might actually fail. Because at some point, China or US might think that, oh, this is actually existential threat to me. That's why they're attacking me so much. And even the nuclear deterrence will start to get frayed, right? So it's actually worse in that sense, some of the escalations that they're talking about. So yeah, it's
The paper's way of countering this is by saying that the escalation ladder has to be very transparent. Correct. And it has to basically actually be an international protocol that and it should be very clear signaling on the part of the countries in their attempts to sabotage, whether overtly or not, as they try and do this. But yeah, there is risks of this framework just resulting in constant low-level risk conflict between countries, where it basically does stop the incentives that flow into making AI systems better and improving them. But also that given that AI is a general purpose technology, and given that the problems of solving AI and improving it is done globally, right? It doesn't happen in a single country, in a single place, but instead it's like problems are distributed across the globe. Scientists from around the globe are collaborating and working on it. There are papers being co-authored across continents. There is that right now. There is a level of that collaborative thinking happening around AI. But the way this paper frames the world when it comes to AI progress is that, extremely siloed approaches within borders, each country developing its own AI systems, and that potentially rivaling or not rivaling others. And so that's a very closed approach as opposed to what we currently have. So is that kind of an environment even applicable, like you said, Bharath, that this is emerging out of civilian innovation, eventually having military repercussions. So perhaps we will reach there someday, because AI will get so better. Governments will come and take control and dictate how it is, where it is done and how it is being used. But right now, that is not the world we live in, right?
No, actually, I don't fully agree with that characterization. I think if you look at AI, the higher end AI model development, I would say that I don't think the labs, whether it's OpenAI, Anthropic, I don't think they are collaborating with each other so much. I mean, there may be some leakage of human capital across them, but I don't think they're collaborating as much. I don't think their papers are as open as they used to be. So we are already seeing a place where, because in this space, ideas are your tool to advance, there is less collaboration there. I also don't believe that collaboration between, say, a DeepSeek and a OpenAI will be high at all, right? So in some sense, the private markets have already arrived at that point where there is siloed competition in AI development. So I don't think that's an issue. Yeah, if governments get involved in it, how will that paradigm change? Will the government then decide that there are some countries with whom we'll collaborate, there are others with whom we won't? That may change. Today, it's very clearly firms that are in competition with each other, and they don't collaborate because it's of no benefit to them, and that's fine. That's a decision for a firm to make. I don't know how that changes if governments get involved in it. So yeah.
On collaboration, yeah. So maybe there's still talk. The kind of AI that they are referring to might still be far advanced than what we see right now. So in that case, I don't know when we get to that point what would be the restrictions or guardrails that governments will put in place to ensure that this is not spreading so easily. So they actually talk about open source models, not having these kind of very capable models being open source, because that means everybody can use it, and you don't know, you will not be able to contain the risks associated with them so easily. So I'm not sure if we get to that point where these models are that capable. Maybe those kind of restrictions or not on willingness to cooperate will also decrease as this goes by. So one thing that this reminds me of is Anthropic's responsible scaling laws. I mean, what they say is that as the capability of a model increases, when it's more capable, the guardrails that they will build around it also will scale accordingly. So the how they test, how extensively they will test it, or how they will limit the kind of users that it can be put to. So all of that will also scale along with the capabilities of the model. So that kind of a trajectory is something that we might see even without as the scaling also happens. So
Yeah, that brings us to an interesting point, which is that a lot of the approaches in the paper are state driven, right? It's the role of the state in controlling AI. But what you said, the ladder that Anthropic is using for Claude, and how they're going to get the testing process become more extensive as they grow their model, is a good example of what private corporations can do in this whole debate. So what else do you see private companies doing as they evolve their models? Is there a role for them to play in this whole deterrence game?
Specific to the deterrence game, yes. I mean, obviously, so before we get into what private companies can do, let's also touch, we've only been criticizing the model so far. So let's also think about the good things about it, right? I think it's a good paper in the sense that it does make an important point that states should think very carefully about what is happening with AI development and what roles they should be playing. So one of the slightly more subtler points they make in one part around the what is that, the competition thing, right, between states, where they talk about deterrence to each other, is they're not, or at least that's the way I read it, they're not actually saying that other countries should not try to seek an AI monopoly. They're just kind of arguing that, or at least it seemed to me that way, that they are arguing that don't try to get take unnecessary risks in trying to get to an AI monopoly. So you should not, and that's also my criticism of the report, that it's not clear to me if they're more worried about loss of control to a super intelligent AI, or if they're more worried about, say, China or some other country building the first super intelligent AI and therefore becoming a monopoly. So in some places they push toward this side and say we should stop that. In the other, they are like, oh, loss of control to an AI is a bigger problem. So loss of control to an AI is an interesting problem to think about, right? States should have conversations with each other saying, what kind of risks are we taking, or are people taking in building super intelligence? Is it too much risk? How should there be an escalation ladder there, where at some point we can say, no, you can't take these risks? I think that's a conversation worth having. The same thing with deterrence, right? There's no question that all countries agree that you don't want a rogue actor getting access to a super intelligent AI. So how do you think about that deterrence, right? How do you stop that from happening? How do you stop them from accessing data centers and infrastructure power? How do you stop them from getting weights? When you come to that area, clearly private firms have a huge role to play, because they are at the forefront of this AI development. When Meta says that our models are open weight models, that has an implication. I mean, if I can take the open weight model of a Meta, and if that is good enough to, I don't know, for me to build a biological weapon at some point of time, then Meta is definitely bound to think about the fact that their model can do that, and they should come up with guardrails. And I do feel like governments have a role to play in sitting down with them and saying, what is the standard, right? You could use Anthropic's models. There may be other similar risk models. There are a lot of people doing risk research, right? So there may be ways of doing that, but you should think about it. It should not be fully left to private players, because their incentives might clearly be different.
Going back to the thing that I was talking about, that this the private sector is kind of taking the lead on building the most cutting edge AI models that are out there. So you'll see that private companies will have incentives to to seek the most profit maximizing path for themselves. So how do they build the most capable models? How do they get it to market first? How do they capture the most market share, and so on? So in that kind of a race, they might deprioritize maybe building safeguards. So I think recently OpenAI had not tested one of their recent models as extensively as they used to earlier. So that's something that they might see as an option, so that they can fast track how quickly they can get their models out. So in this kind of a situation, the stand that So you need someone to enforce that these models need to be tested adequately, or guardrails should be in place and all of that. So that's I think where the state comes in. But at the same time, when this paper is talking about super intelligence and those risks as the main concern, it might also be deprioritizing some of the more immediate concerns of private companies like OpenAI or others, building such capable models and then having such market power that they can then take decisions that have, impact a very big section of the economy, or you're locked into, say, governments are dependent on them, or other companies are dependent on them, and they're able to dictate terms about how it's going to be used or what you can do with it, and so on, right? So those kind of risks to because of concentration of market power are also very near term things that should not be neglected when you're thinking about super intelligence.
Yeah, and like you said, setting the safety standards, or setting those thresholds of, like, this reminds me of the movie Oppenheimer, where he asks his fellow scientist what should the threshold be, and he says 3 million, and threshold for the atmosphere not catching fire after detonating the nuclear bomb. And so these thresholds are things that governments should enforce, but they'll likely not be able to come up with those thresholds. These are better done by private companies. So yeah, there is definitely a collaborative role to play. And drawing from another similar analogy is that with the nuclear missile, like you said, if someone is preparing the missile and then they fire it, and that's the point of no return. But with AI, it's a lot more incremental, and we might the erosion of human control over AI systems can be, it can be more incremental, more insidious. It might seem like a series of small steps that eventually take us to a point where so much of our daily lives are being handled by AI systems. And the paper calls this as humanity just being passive passengers in this whole journey. And then it's like the cost of turning it off, or even if there is human control to turn off these AI systems, the costs are so high that we'll not do that. What are your thoughts on these? Because I found this to be a very interesting take, and also a good justification of why we should be thinking about these issues now rather than later.
So I just wanted to make one slight clarification. When I said MAME and MAD, the difference, right? I actually think that when it comes to nuclear deterrence, no one can fire a nuclear missile at you and eradicate you completely before you respond. Correct. So in that sense, the use of nuclear weapons is also an incremental game. It doesn't last very long, maybe 3 or 4 strikes and you're all done. But it is kind of incremental. And MAME is similar to MAD in the sense that every attempt at an AI, but in MAME it's the opposite. If I build a super intelligent AI, you have no chance after that now. Presumably, you have no chance after that. So in that sense, it's slightly different. So it is more likely that, and we are, it's not just an AI thing. We also see it with normal technology, right? Things that we were doing manually are today fully automated, and people have forgotten how to do those things manually. Prime example I can think of is many people who drive cars today are not very familiar with how to maintain their car, because it's not possible anymore. The amount of electronics inside a car is such that there's no way for anybody to repair a car itself. That's an example of technology taking away some knowledge from our head. And the same thing will happen with AI. More and more you'll have AIs making decisions, and humans no longer being aware of the fact that AI is making decisions, and that will keep escalating. We should not expect it to come back down unless you make an effort. And every time, broadly, when AI gets more intelligent, you should expect that intelligence will diffuse back to every other decision, right? Because it's a general purpose technology. The more intelligent AIs get, it's not like an AI in one domain will not be impacted by that. When the general technology improves, we should expect that will diffuse to all areas where these decisions are being made. So that loss of control is going to be incremental at first. And then eventually, if you get to a very suddenly you might find that there's a complete loss of control. So that's why it's important to think about it today in terms of what will happen, what might happen, what are the intersections. So I think that's the way I would look at it. which is why I think it's a good suggestion from the paper that, loss of control. I definitely think that loss of control is something we should worry about. Private firms do worry about it. There are a lot of risk researchers in AI who worry about it, but it's also worth for states to worry about it, and also think about how do you collaborate with each other to make sure that this doesn't happen.
When we're talking about loss of control, the paper argues for, especially in military applications, they argue for increasing adoption of AI in military use cases and changing how military command structures are organized so that they can more readily adopt AI into their operational process. So, and they also argue at the same time for meaningful human oversight. If it, however, which again, I don't know how effective it can be, because the scale at which an AI system would be operating, can you really have a human in the loop to take decisions or approve decisions? So you'll be reliant on a lot of things that the AI is doing, and maybe not able to take decisions independently, right? So this kind of these are two competing pressures, I would think. So you want human in the loop, but also you want to stay competitive, have your military being able to compete with an adversary, and so on, right? So you see in the recent Pahalgam attack and whatever followed after that, that drones are being used increasingly instead of aircrafts, and that kind of a transition, once one example is seen in the field, so you'll see a lot of other militaries also, armed forces, being making that transition to using AI or autonomous weapon systems to fight battles. And now, what that means, would it lead to easier escalation when you engage in conflict, because an AI would perceive something as a threat and retaliate, and humans might not be able to deal with the scale of the threats that it is requiring them to check. So those are things that I think you need a very exhaustive analysis to be able to see where the risks are and how do you make that trade-off. So those things are there. And human impact on humans itself, the paper also makes a interesting thing about how even societal impact coming from loss of jobs and loss of from AI, not just military applications, but also impact of AI diffusion in the economy, and how that would lead to not having a stable society if you see a lot of people losing their jobs and their livelihoods, and what might happen as a result of that. What would be the policy measures that need to be taken now so that you can mitigate some kind of economic impact on society, right? So those are things that need to be thought of seriously and planned for the long term.
One interesting exercise that I've heard the US military do when it comes to their preparedness is, at least in the domain of space technology, there is the scenario in space that if there is ever a Kessler syndrome and all the assets are lost, then all the militaries across the world will be crippled because they depend on this technology so much. So there is a concerted effort to operate in the absence of this technology completely.
For the benefit of our listeners, what is the Kessler syndrome?
The Kessler syndrome is a condition where...
And the listeners in the room also, by the way.
It's a condition where the debris in the lower Earth orbit or any of the orbits around the Earth, these orbits house all of the satellites that we currently have. We think of space as infinite, but the space technology is restricted to these very narrow highways in space where all the satellites are orbiting the Earth. So if there is ever cascading effect of debris hitting other space objects and collisions happening and more debris getting generated in the process.
Correct. That's a runaway process, basically.
Yeah, it will just descend into a scenario where none of the satellites remain operational and the whole thing is lost. You can't draw a direct analogy to AI, but you can draw an analogy where it comes to dependence aspect. That as more and more of our processes depend on AI, an absence of this technology will cripple the process itself. So there are efforts and exercises that take this into account and try and operate in the complete absence of space technology for communication, for reconnaissance, for surveillance, and all of that in some countries. So do you think it's worthwhile pursuing such protocols for in the realm of AI also? Just assume that even if such a MAME deterrence worldview comes true and data centers and AI technology is being targeted across the board, then we should still be at least be on a baseline level operational in what we want to do.
But do you see these protocols as like intergovernmental protocols, or that each country should have its own set of protocols to have some resilience to this kind of an attack?
Yeah, I think it should be at a country level.
I mean, yeah, that makes sense. I assume that as you go along a technological ladder, countries will develop those kind of protocols where you don't fall below a certain threshold if something happens, right? I think that makes sense. But that also brings me to another point, which again Pranay had raised in his newsletter as well, where he says that the report is very heavily like US-China focused and ignores everybody else, right? It assumes that every other country in the world will just ride along with whatever they decide, right? So as he says, like, you're basically essentially saying that we will kneecap any country's AI development to protect our own advantage. So naturally, every other country will then say, okay, then I should actually support proliferation because it will benefit me in the end, right? Which, if you think about it, also happened in the nuclear space. Despite all the attempts at control, almost any country you think of as a rogue nation today has access to nuclear bombs. So when even in nuclear, which is such a controlled, physical, limited, or custom specific technology, you could not protect proliferation. The idea that you can prevent proliferation or diffusion in a very general purpose technology like AI, which is more about idea and math, it seems somehow silly to me. I don't really think you can do it. So it's better to collaborate, come up with, like, to me, I don't, even though I can't assign a 0 probability to a super intelligent AI, I also can't assign, like, I can't imagine a scenario where people assume that a super intelligent AI will automatically turn into Skynet and try to take over. And I don't see why that should be the case. It is entirely possible that a super intelligent AI is not harmful to us. It's just benign, and maybe the harms are indirect. So I think we are better, rather than trying to deny others, it's probably better to collaborate, and we should not have loss of control to AI. But otherwise, we should not stop countries from trying to build AIs at their own pace, whatever that pace might be. Maybe an India is not going to operate at the same pace and focus on the same things that a China does or a US does. But I see no reason why you should be trying to kneecap other countries. That's a very unstable kind of an equilibrium.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying about how arms control or some kind of a cooperation, those kind of measures might be more favorable to assuming that it's you're trying to deal with an adversary and everyone's going to just trying to outpace each other and you're planning for the worst, right? So maybe there are ways in which you can cooperate and agree at some kind of limits or threshold beyond which, or things that you will not do, and get cooperation based on that. And and also on your point about having things de-linked from AI, maybe that is something that has to be considered. Maybe you don't want your nuclear weapons to be controlled in any way by an AI system, which could escalate beyond a certain point. So those kind of air capping kind of measures might be something that's required when you're building these things or planning how they're structured, right?
Yeah, I broadly agree, because even here, in the main way that AI diffusion is being controlled is either controlling the chips or controlling the spread of the model weights, which is now the new trend. But even there, what you're essentially doing is that you are raising the costs for countries to acquire these chips. Maybe the cost is infinite for some countries, but what ends up happening in the real world is that the countries which we can say are non-malicious will not have a huge marginal benefit in acquiring these chips, and so they will just accept the new reality. But the so-called rogue nations, who actually have a high marginal benefit from acquiring the chips from whatever means, will try and do it, and will might as well succeed, just as countries like North Korea have succeeded today in developing a nuclear arsenal. So ultimately, these will just arm the bad actors and deny the technology to a lot of the harmless actors, which might have actually had positive offshoots and developed the technology in a positive direction.
Yeah.
So
I mean, plus, like, again, it's not very clear where the next breakthrough is going to come from for us, right? Like, again, going back to DeepSeek, what they showed us is that they just because they did not have access to the very latest AI chips from NVIDIA, they just focused on optimizations and managed to bring their model performance up to levels that others did not think possible. And that information and that knowledge is out there. So everybody can now build a model that can run on lesser chips than before. So, innovation will find a path around all these kind of constraints. You're not going to stop it from happening. So, I don't think you should try to do that.
Like when you spoke about chips, right? I found it interesting how the paper called chips as the fissile material.
Yeah.
Like when you're making that nuclear analogy, what say the fuel was to nuclear weapons, chips are to AI, and how do you then control it or restrict access to it? And you see a lot of these kind of measures already being rolled out. So the diffusion framework was one which is being rolled back, but there are also export controls on chips for AI. There are talks of tracking or building tracking mechanisms so that you know where geographically the chip is located. And then you can maybe take actions based on that. So those kind of measures may be leading down this path of confronting, and it's not always going to be a conventional war where you have this escalation ladder, right? So there are a lot of asymmetric options. You can maybe build all of these things, but there might be cyber attacks in some neglected part of your economy, or there might be bioweapons which you don't need to, which you can't really control as effectively, right? So, and you don't need the most sophisticated kind of AI models, systems to be able to build, to kind of develop these kind of asymmetric attack capabilities. So you just need a small vulnerability, and and those can be exploited. So there is no credible deterrence against this.
One more thing I found interesting in the paper is the division between the physical and the digital realm. So, and this is true in general also, right? With governments and people generally try to control the physical things because our control over the digital or the intangible things are limited. And so you see this playing out with AI export controls also. They control the chips itself. And even with other strategic technologies, there are geographic restrictions. A lot of it is the physical aspect. But with AI, it's a different ballgame, because mostly it does exist in the digital realm, but depends on physical assets, obviously. But there is also a lot of automation happening in the world today, with especially like robots and autonomous vehicles, autonomous robots, autonomous industrial equipment, AI is being integrated into those systems also. And essentially they have now a level of artificial intelligence of their own. And the paper describes this as the entry of AI into the physical space, and how that's also a risk. I mean, notwithstanding all of the amazing sci-fi work that has come out of this idea, any thoughts here? I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at this.
I don't see how you can stop it from happening, is my first thought on it, right? Like, robotics has been making its own progress, and clearly I don't think there's any thought in the world that you may feel odd that somebody else in the world has not had, and they feel like it's good. Like, for example, for the longest time, people building robots used to say that a robot must not look too human-like, because that will scare people off. But just recently I was reading an article about, I think, a company in the US or somewhere, saying we want to build robots that are very human-like. So here is a thought that for a long time most people thought is not good and we should not do it this way. But now there's somebody who says, no, we should do it this way. And they're going to try and build it. I think the same thing will happen with AI and robots. It's a very nice, it's almost a inevitable sort of combination that somebody will say, that an AI developer will say, oh, I need access to a robot because it will give me physical inputs and it will allow me to learn the world better. And a robotics person will say, I need an AI because it will help my robot become better. I think it's almost inevitable. Again, the question is the same, right? Are there areas where you should be more careful and less careful? Driverless cars, I don't know. Waymo seems to be doing pretty well with their driverless cars. They have excellent reduction in accident rates and all of that. So maybe driverless cars are okay. In healthcare, it might be okay to have an AI-assisted robot. Why not? But one might argue that why not have AI robots in the military space doing your battles for you, right? Because at least you will avoid loss of life. On the other hand, if only robots are fighting your wars, then there's no difference between an actual war and a video game. So maybe the threshold for war goes down. So I don't think there are easy answers to these questions. One thing I think is it's almost inevitable that AI and robotics will go hand in hand and they will merge with each other. We'll just have to figure out what is this cybernetic organism going to look like and what does that mean and what are the ethics of how they operate. So.
Well, this has been an extremely interesting conversation, folks, and I hope our listeners find it as entertaining as I found it. And this also is a reminder for all of us to keep thinking about these things, because most of the times we just observe and leave it at that. But the world we live in today, technology is advancing very rapidly, and it raises a lot of policy questions, regulatory questions, ethical and moral dilemmas as well. And so it's always important for us to scrutinize any technological development that we see around us and have our own mental framework about what we think about this and where it should go. And these conversations at our individual levels is the one thing that will eventually translate into policymakers taking it seriously and it actually having it being a real significant debate. And because these things should be debates. Thanks, Rijesh and Bharath. If you have any closing thoughts, you can say.
Just one closing thought. I think this superintelligence thing, it's not official US policy, thankfully, yet. But it does move, if someone as influential as Eric Schmidt is saying something like this, people in India should think about what happens if this turns out to become US policy. How does India react? What should we do? I think it's a fertile area of research. And we should at least have some ideas on how you would cope with this kind of a regime. So, yeah, I just want to leave people with that.
Yeah, and I guess when you're talking about international fora where a lot of risk-based discussions like bias and all of these kind of measures are being considered. So some of these geopolitics or related developments also will start coming up in those forums also. So for us also, so you'll see that also being a topic of discussion maybe, and how you can collaborate on, or maybe that's wishful thinking that there will be collaboration on these kind of issues as well. Let's see. We'll see.
Well, thank you, listeners. Catch you at the next one.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.